Mist clung low to the reed plains of Chiron 7, rolling off the water in a slow drift that blurred horizon and sky into the same dull gray. The air tasted of damp soil and river weed, the kind of silence that only a frontier world carried. No engines, no voices, just the occasional flap of a marsh bird rising from the shallows. Jaden Vale walked the inlet as he had every morning for 3 years, the rhythm of his steps steady, his measuring pole balanced in one hand, the slate strapped to his forearm waiting for numbers. The river was his duty now, its flow and levels. Recorded, gates adjusted, channels cleared. Not glamorous work, but steady. After a decade in the Federation Scout Corps, chasing ambushes on worlds no one remembered by name, this was the quiet he had sought. A place where the only orders came from water and season. His eyes moved as much as his hands, scanning the banks without thought. Old habits, carved into him by years of patrols, didn't vanish. He never crouched with his back exposed, never lingered too long with his head bent over the slate. Peace hadn't blunted those instincts, though he sometimes wished it had. They made him feel like a soldier walking in a farmer's boots. The pole slid down into the water, rippling reeds aside. He expected the familiar drag of silt, the resistance of rock. Instead, the tip pressed into something soft, yet weighted. He frowned, leaned his shoulder into the pole, and prodded again. The reeds parted to reveal a pale bundle half submerged, water lapping at cloth edges. His first thought was simple, a cast-off scrap, caught in the current. Then it shifted. A faint, uneven sound broke the hush. Jaden's pulse kicked the way it had in ambush sites long ago. He dropped to a crouch, shoved reeds aside, and found himself staring into a face no larger than his palm. A child. Skin the deep violet of the plains people. Faint veins glowing blue beneath the surface. Tiny chest rising in shallow spasms. The infant blinked once, lips trembling on a breath that barely came. He didn't think. Muscle memory seized him. Cloak off, strip the wet cloth, press the child against his chest for warmth. Keep airways clear. Heat, shelter, feed if possible. His body carried him back toward his hut at a careful pace, every step chosen to avoid slipping on the mud. Stumble, and he might crush the fragile weight in his arms. Anger, sharp and cold, rose under the discipline. Who cast a newborn adrift in a river? He pressed it down. Anger wasted time. The child's life was the only mission now. The hut stood on short stilts at the bend, reeds drying along its side. He kicked the door open, crossed to the hearth, and had tinder sparked in seconds. Flames caught, heat building fast. He set the child on folded blankets near the stove, checked breath with a practiced hand. Weak, but steady. "You'll live," he murmured under his breath. "No one takes that from you." Water boiled in the iron pot. He stripped cloth into narrow swaddling, dried the child as best he could, pressed her tiny body once more against his skin until color returned faintly to her lips. The grip of her fingers around his thumb startled him, not because it was strong, but because it was alive. That single, instinctive clutch closed something in his chest he hadn't realized was open. When she slept at last, swaddled and warm, Jaden logged the moment on his slate-time inlet conditions. His eyes lingered on the stone tied to the bundle. A clan mark carved deep, 2 overlapping circles cut by a single line. The mark of protection, the mark of belonging. Yet it had been used to send a child to the river, reporting it to the settlement. Council would send her back to those same people. His jaw set. He set the stone aside. The fire crackled low, broth simmering soft in the pot, the smell of roots filling the single room. Jaden sat with his back against the wall, the child's. Small breath whispering steady in the quiet. For years he had told himself he was finished with missions, with choices that carried weight beyond his own life. Tonight he understood he had lied to himself. The river had delivered more than water. It had given him a life to protect, and a vow he had already made. Rain drifted down in a steady drizzle, slicking the reed roofs and soaking the earth until the inlet banks turned to mud. Jaden Vale spent those first 2 days keeping the fire hot, feeding the infant broth in drops from a reed tube, and watching the color settle back into her skin. She was stronger now, her breathing steadier, but he never let her out of reach. For long. At night he slept half upright against the wall, the child on his chest, waking at every shift of breath. The river's silence had always been background. Now it carried weight. Each ripple or bird call sounded like an intrusion waiting to happen. On the morning of the 3rd day, the knock came. Not a demand, not the hard rap of a council runner. 3 soft taps, spaced apart, hesitant. Jaden was already on his feet, hand brushing the knife on the counter as he moved to the door. His pulse stayed level, but his body remembered cautious. Ready, like patrol nights on hostile worlds. He opened it. 2 figures stood in the drizzle, clothes clinging, mud streaked to their knees. The elder was tall, long black hair braided down her back, a ceremonial wrap torn and frayed until it covered little more than her frame. Her eyes glowed bronze in the gray light, steady even while her shoulders trembled with cold. Beside her stood a younger woman, shorter, hair streaked with cobalt dye. A work tunic knotted around her waist, legs bare to the storm. Her stance was defiant, chin lifted, eyes sweeping him once from boots to shoulders before locking onto his. The elder spoke first, her voice low but edged with control. "You found a child?" Jaden studied her, the rain slicking down his own cloak. "I did. She is mine." The words cracked on the last note, though she forced her spine straight. The younger stepped forward, chin high. "I'm her sister. We were cast out for trying to stop what they did. We followed the river drag. We're not leaving her again." Jaden's gaze ran over them, posture, hands, signs of deception. What he saw was exhaustion, mud ground into skin, hunger in the tightness of their jaws. Real, desperate. His chest tightened with confirmation, not surprise. The knock had only been a matter of time. "Fire's lit," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." They entered slowly. The elder's eyes dropped to the floor, then to the bundle by the fire. When she saw the child swaddled on the blanket, something inside her broke. She dropped to her knees, scooped the infant into her arms, and pressed her face against the small head. Her shoulders shook once before she forced herself still again. The younger woman walked boldly past, scanning every corner of the hut, eyes taking in the tools, the stove, the order of the room. She leaned against the table with deliberate ease, but her gaze returned to him, sharp and testing. "You could have given her to the council," she said. "I don't do that," Jaden answered, her head tilted, the faintest smirk tugging her lips. "Good." The elder rocked her child near the fire, whispering words too soft for him to catch. The baby stirred, then stilled against her warmth. Jaden watched them both, the weight of his choice settling deeper. These women brought risk attention, pursuit, the kind of politics he had come to Chiron 7 to avoid. Yet he couldn't look at the mother's arms wrapped around her child and tell them to leave. He set 3 bowls on the table, ladled steaming broth, and spoke with the same flat steadiness he used for orders once given and followed. "Eat first," he said. "Then we'll talk." The hut grew quiet, except for the sound of spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. For the first time in years, the stillness inside these walls had shifted. It was no longer the silence of solitude. It was the breath of people who had stopped running if only for a moment. The mist clung heavy that morning, seeping through the cracks in the shutters until the room wore a faint veil of gray. Jaden stoked the fire back to life, feeding it with split reeds until the coals glowed and heat chased the damp from the air. Behind him, the two women stirred, shifting under the cloaks he had laid out. The baby whimpered, a thin cry that made Serena the elder move instantly, cradling the child close to her chest. Jaden watched with the stillness of a man who measured every detail. The way Serena's hands trembled, not from fear but from exhaustion. The way Callan, the younger, pushed hair from her face with a kind of careless defiance, though her eyes never stopped moving, never stopped cataloging his tools, his stove, even the patched seam of the hut's curtain. The child's faint glow pulsed at her wrists and temples, veins shimmering under skin. Jaden crouched near the fire, checking the warmth of the broth simmering low. "She's stronger," he said simply. Serena nodded without looking at him. Stronger, yes. But unnamed, she's still only a shadow. Her voice was flat, but the weight of it filled the room. Callan leaned against the table, smirking faintly. Here it comes. She'll argue with herself for days before she decides. That's what she does. Jaden's eyes narrowed slightly, though his voice stayed even. Then decide. Serena looked at him sharply, lips tightening. He didn't flinch, only gestured toward the infant. It's not for me to give. That's yours. But if she's to live, she needs more than food and fire. She needs a name to hold. Silence stretched. The fire popped. The baby shifted in her arms, tiny fingers brushing against Serena's collarbone as if urging her. Serena lowered her head, whispering something in her own tongue, low, melodic, private. She closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the word came out clear and final. Nigh. Callan blinked, the smirk fading into something softer. Small light. Jaden repeated it once, voice low, letting it settle in the air. Nigh. He looked at the child, at the way her glow flickered faintly like embers. It fits. Serena's lips pressed together, but the tremor in her shoulders eased. She kissed the baby's forehead, murmuring the name again, as though speaking it. Made the child more solid in her arms. For the first time since they had entered, Callan grinned without edge. At least now we don't have to keep saying the child. She stretched out on the bench, arms folded behind her head, watching Jaden with something like curiosity instead of suspicion. You're different, she said. Most men would have let the river take her. He poured broth into bowls, setting one in front of each of them. Most men aren't here, he said flatly. Serena's gaze lingered on him a moment longer, searching for something she didn't name. She whispered the name once more, softer this time. Nigh. The child stirred at the sound, a small sigh, escaping her lips before she settled back to sleep. The firelight danced against the walls, and for a moment the hut no longer felt like an outpost against the river. It felt like the beginning of something unplanned, fragile, but undeniable. A child with a name, a mother who had fought to keep her, a sister who refused to leave, and a man who had chosen to stand with them. Outside, the mist thinned, and the river carried on with its steady flow. Inside, 3 lives and a newborn shared a silence that was no longer empty. It was the silence of belonging, tentative but real. Dusk bled across the reed plains in bands of copper and gray. The mist had thinned into ribbons that clung low to the ground, curling around Jaden's boots as he walked the inlet path back to the hut. He carried his measuring pole slung over one shoulder, the slate under his arm, but his eyes were fixed on the horizon. Something had shifted in the quiet too still, too deliberate. The hairs at the back of his neck prickled. Smoke from his stove coiled faint above the hut's roofline. In any other season it would have gone unnoticed, one plume among many. But the clans watched the outer flats when they chose, and Jaden knew the risk the moment he saw a shadow break the fog near the waterline. A reed skiff nosed through the Shallows, the oar dipping without sound. He reached the door, set the pole against the frame, and stepped inside. Serena looked up from the fire where she was mending cloth, nigh asleep in her sling. Callan sat at the table, sharpening a piece of scrap into a crude toy. They both read his face instantly. "Someone's coming," Jaden said. His tone was level, but his eyes cut sharp to Serena. "Stay by the fire. Keep her quiet." The knock came moments later, brisk and certain, not the hesitant taps from days before. This was the rhythm of a man on duty. Jaden opened the door. A council runner stood there, reed cloak dripping, eyes sharp beneath the hood. He glanced past Jaden's shoulder at the smoke, the shadows inside. "Your logs show a gap," he said without greeting. 2 days unreported. Unusual. Jaden met his gaze without blinking. The river was steady. Nothing to report. The runner's eyes narrowed, sliding over Jaden's shoulder again. And yet the hut smells of broth and sounds less empty than it should. Before Jaden could reply, Serena rose. She stepped into view, nigh pressed to her chest, the clanstone in her hand. Her posture was rigid, ceremonial even, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her blood. "If you mean to name what you smell or hear, then name it properly," she said. Her voice was low, but carried weight. She held the stone forward, so the markings caught the firelight, 2 overlapping circles caught by a line. Protection, belonging. That is what this mark meant before your elders twisted it into exile. The runner faltered. For a heartbeat, his eyes flicked to the child, to the faint glow beneath her skin, then back to Serena's unyielding face. Callan stood behind her sister, shoulders squared, a silent wall of defiance. Jaden didn't move, but the steadiness in his stance said plainly he would not allow the runner to step further inside. A long silence stretched. The council runner finally drew back his hood. "I'll mark your hut as quiet," he said, though. His tone was unsettled, but word of smoke travels. Others may come who listen less. He pushed the skiff off into the current without another glance. The door closed. The sound of water swallowed his retreat. Inside, Serena's shoulders sagged. With a breath she hadn't realized she held. Callan smirked faintly, though her eyes were sharper than usual. Jaden set the bar across the door with deliberate care. "They'll be back," he said simply. Serena touched the sleeping child's cheek, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Then we'll be ready." The fire snapped, shadows flickering. Across the walls. For the first time since pulling the infant from the river, Jaden understood that his choice was no longer private. The river had carried more than a child to his door. It had carried a reckoning. The storm broke in sheets that night, rain hammering the roof until every other sound drowned beneath it. Inside, the fire held steady, a warm circle of light that seemed the only stable thing in the world. Jaden sat by the hearth, the utility blade in his hand scraping against the whetstone in slow, steady strokes. It wasn't that the knife needed sharpening. He needed the rhythm, the order, something to keep the edges of his thoughts contained. Across the room, Serena rocked nigh in her arms, her braid damp from when she'd stepped out to draw water earlier. The child glowed faintly against her chest, a small pulse of light beneath swaddled cloth. Callan sprawled on the bench, cloak draped around her shoulders, eyes half shut but never still, always sliding back to Jaden as if testing how much she could read from his silence. When the storm softened, Serena's voice broke the hush. "Why?" she asked, simple but sharp. "Why take her from the river? You could have turned away, and no one would have known." Jaden set the blade aside, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Because she was alive, that was enough. Serena's eyes searched his, wary, brittle. Callan snorted softly, but there was no mockery in it this time. Most men would have said the opposite, that it wasn't their problem. You don't sound like most men. He shrugged. I've seen what happens when everyone looks away. I'm finished doing that. The words landed heavy in the air. Serena tightened her hold on Nye, her throat working as if she wanted to speak and swallow her pride at the same time. Finally, she lowered her gaze to the infant. She deserves more than shadows, she whispered. Callan swung her legs off the bench, leaning forward. Ben, don't hide her. Don't hide us. You've already made your choice. Jaden didn't answer, but the way he stoked the fire and added another log was reply enough. Later, practical needs drew them closer. Serena tried to clean the baby. With cloths warmed in the basin, her hands shaking from fatigue. Jaden moved beside her, dipped the cloth, wrung it out, and handed it back without a word. Their fingers brushed, and she froze for a breath before accepting it. The smallest gesture, yet it loosened something in her posture that hadn't eased since she walked through his door. Callan watched from the bench, her tone soft but edged. Careful, she doesn't trust men, not after what our clan did. Serena shot her sister a warning look, but Callan only grinned faintly, though her eyes were serious. You're different, though. Stubborn, quiet. You don't flinch from our shame. Jaden kept his voice steady, not rising to the bait. The child, Comey's first. Everything else waits. The words settled over the room heavier than they should have. Serena's lips parted, then closed again, her eyes dropping to Nye. Callan tilted her head, studying him as though she had heard more in his tone than he'd meant to give Dot by the time the fire burned low. The baby was clean and swaddled again, asleep in Serena's arms. Callan stretched out on the bench, but closer now, no smirk in her eyes, just curiosity. Jaden laid down near the door, the soldier's place, but his body was tense for reasons beyond habit. The storm outside thrashed against the hut, but inside warmth held. Serena shifted drowsily and, half asleep, leaned against him where he sat. She didn't pull away. Callan cracked an eye, caught the sight, and for once didn't speak. She only smiled faintly and turned back toward the fire. Dot. It wasn't planned, but in that quiet, something settled. Not strangers, not yet family, but moving closer. A fragile tether, chosen in firelight. Jaden lay awake longer than usual, listening to their breathing blend with the soft crackle of the coals. For years he had measured rivers, numbers without meaning. Tonight he measured something else, the shape of people pressing into his life, and the choice he'd already made to let them stay. Dawn broke pale over the reed flats, the mist rising in veils that glowed faintly under the first light. The hut smelled of smoke and broth, the steady warmth of a fire that had burned through the night. Jaden Vale sat at the table, sharpening his short blade as he always did at first light, the scrape steady, deliberate. But the rhythm no longer belonged to solitude. Behind him came the soft sound of Serena stirring, Nye pressed against her chest, the child's small hand curling into the collar of the shirt she wore his shirt, borrowed without apology. Callan leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, cobalt streaks in her hair catching the thin light. She watched them both, not with suspicion, but with the sly grin of someone who had stopped running. For the first time since they arrived, the air in the hut wasn't weighed down by fear. It carried something heavier, but steadier. Choice, Serena's. Voice broke the silence, even but laced with tension. If we remain here, if this becomes our life, what does that make us to you? Burdens? Guests or something else? Jaden set the blade aside, meeting her gaze without hesitation. Family, if you choose it. Callan gave a soft laugh, shaking her head. Just like that? You decide? And it's done? No. His voice was calm, unyielding. I decided for myself the moment I pulled her from the river. But family is something you must choose too. both of you." His eyes moved between them. "So what do you want?" The fire popped, filling the pause. Serena's throat worked as she tried to speak. Pride and exhaustion warred in her face, fear of rejection against a fragile hope. At last she lowered her head, kissed Nye's crown, and whispered, "I want her safe. I want her to grow where no one calls her cursed." Then she lifted her, eyes to his, steady now. "If that means staying, then yes. I choose this." Callan pushed from the doorway, crossing to the table with a smirk softer than any he had seen. She dropped into the chair opposite him, chin propped on her fist. "Think. I'd leave her to do this alone? If she stays, I stay. You'll have to live with both of us." A rare smile tugged Jaden's mouth. "That's what I want." The decision closed the door on solitude. That night, they marked it not with ceremony, but with what little they had left. Fried Draxon mushrooms, Zirin crumbs toasted crisp, a thin, broth thickened with herbs. Nye dozed in her sling, while Serena and Callan teased him about the way he chopped roots too evenly. When the baby finally slept, Serena laid her in a makeshift cradle, a fish crate lined with cloth. For the first time, her shoulders didn't tighten when she stepped back. She sat beside Jaden instead, Callan dropping the cloak over all three of them. Small touches replaced words. Serena's fingers brushing his hand, Callan's knee pressing lightly against his. Jaden's arms settling around them both in quiet acceptance that it wasn't hurried, wasn't forced. Trust layered itself in firelight, in silence, in the choice not to look away. When they finally lay down, tangled close with Nye's breathing steady in the cradle, Jaden understood with clarity sharper than any order he had once followed. This was no longer a house of one. It was theirs, bound not by law or clan, but by consent and decision. Days folded into rhythm. Gate checks at dawn, drying reeds by noon. Shared meals stretched thin but filling. Serena's stitching mended the curtains. Callan painted the baby's cradle with a cobalt stripe. Jaden hung his measuring slate on the wall, away from small hands. Peace wasn't an act anymore. It was the shape of their days. One evening, as dusk stained the sky, Jaden returned from the inlet with damp sleeves. Serena sat cross-legged on the floor, guiding Nye's hand with a spoon, both streaked with Lauren porridge. Callan laughed openly at the mess. Jaden leaned in the doorway, letting the sight hold longer than he meant. "Report," he said softly. "Training is effective." Serena answered with mock gravity before she laughed, a sound still rare but warmer now. He crossed to the table and sat down, a small reed whistle bound with copper wire. "For when she's older," he said. Serena touched it, something unguarded flickering across her face. "She'll carry this house with her wherever she goes," she whispered. But later that night, as the fire dimmed, Serena's hand lingered. On the clan stone still kept on the table. Her face tightened. "You should know," she said at last, her voice low. "This mark doesn't only mean protection. It is the sigil of a bloodline. My bloodline. Nye isn't cursed. She is heir. They didn't throw her away because she was weak. They cast her out because her survival threatens their power." The words dropped like stones in the silence. Callan's smirk vanished. Jaden's jaw set, his mind measuring this revelation as surely as he once measured ambush sites. The river had carried not only a child to his hut, but the seed of rebellion. Looked at Serena, at Callan, at the infant glowing faintly in her cradle. The choice he had made by the river had already bound him. This truth only deepened it. He reached for the slate hanging by the door, scratched a note beneath the days. Mark, flow steady, family steady. He set it back and turned to them. "Whatever comes," he said, voice even but sure. "We face it together." Serena closed her eyes, relief and fear mingling in her breath. Callan smirked faintly again, but it was sharper now, ready. Nye stirred in her cradle, a small glow pulsing steady beneath her skin. The river outside kept flowing, indifferent. Inside the hut, something had been set against it, fragile, dangerous, but chosen. A family, bound by decision, daring to last.